Hey everybody, this is John from Pioneer Nexus MTG, coming at you with the top decks on the modern format going into March of 2024. Now, obviously there's been some shakeups due to the Pro Tour, primarily in the form of this evolved version of Rakdos midrange, that being Rakdos Vampires. Now, this is somewhat the same Rakdos midrange deck you know and love, just with a vampire slant to it. It was the breakout deck of the Pioneer Pro Tour recently in Chicago, taking advantage of the combination of Saurian Imperious Bloodlords -3, putting in Vein Ripper. Vein Ripper being a very difficult to kill creature, requiring either Edict effects, Wrath effects, or basically taking 2 or 3 for 1 to kill it between the wards, sacrifice a creature, and then as creatures are dying, including itself, I do believe you are pinging your opponent for 2, so kind of like a whole bunch of different effects wrapped into one thing. It is 6 mana, so it is kind of castable, does not have haste or anything, but with the ability of Sorin to basically show and tell it into play. This was kind of the breakout deck / card of the Pioneer Pro Tour. There are some matchups where it's not particularly relevant. Quint combo, Lotus Field combo, etc. I mean, it is a relatively fast clock, but at the same time, there are some decks that just don't care about it. Other decks like Blue-White Control have some ways around it, like counterspelling Sorin, edicting the Vein Ripper itself, or I guess wrathing the Vein Ripper itself. But the danger with this being in play and multiple other creatures, if your opponent wraths you, they're taking a boatload of damage, and that just all turns out positive for the Rakdos player. Other than that, you are primarily, the Rakdos shell, except for with a slightly heavier emphasis on things like Cavern of Souls and Mutavault, which play obviously with the tribal theme of the deck, and then beyond that you play Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, Duress. Nothing too fancy there. Smuggler's Copter in some number. Some variants play Preacher of the Schism, others don't. There's a whole lot of different, whatever the correct setup for this is yet. Some versions play a higher number of Dusk Legion Zealots. Preacher of the Schism is an interesting one. Whenever Preacher of the Schism attacks the player with the most life or tie for the most life, create a 1/1 vampire. Preacher of the Schism attacks while you have the most life, you draw a card. So either you're creating a 1/1 vampire if you're attacking your opponent, or you're drawing a card and losing a life, either of which is pretty reasonable. Fable, kind of a staple in these red mirrored or red mid-range decks, whether it be this, Creativity, any decks like that, regular Rakdos mid-range. And then I do believe the winning deck, Seth Manfield's version of the deck did have 1 on Shieldred, and the main deck just a generically good card in an otherwise mostly vampire mid-range deck. Sideboard, just a bunch of stuff you've come to know and love in these Rakdos mid-range decks. Leyline of the Void, this primarily targeting something like Izzet Phoenix, also reasonable against some of the other graveyard nonsense decks, such as Grease Fang or Neoform Combo, just being able to shut those decks down pretty effectively. You might also bring this in some numbers against Lotus Field Combo to shut off the Leer angle, but other than that, primarily for the decks we just mentioned. Damping Sphere and Krenko's Buzz Crusher, definitely cards that are more targeted towards Lotus Field. Krenko can blow up a Lotus Field without your opponent obviously being targeted, because that has hexproof, but this one just blows up land, destroy up to 1 land, doesn't target it, so you get around the indestructible there. Does have the slight downside of giving your opponent a land, but is what it is. Additional copies of Duress, Running Volley, and Bitter Triumph to kind of round out your removal spells. A couple copies of Path of Peril, primarily there for Amalia Combo. Leyline of the Veil, decent mirror tech, especially against if your opponent's just like show and telling on 3 and you've killed their other creatures. Otherwise, just generically reasonable card against the control and mid-range decks of the format, as well as combo. And one of Cletus, Trader of Get, just kind of helps you tie up against the aggressive decks of the format. This was definitely the breakout deck of the format, and is certainly one of the top 1 or 2 decks in the Pioneer format currently. Rakdos Midrange is a deck that I would have considered probably the top 3 in the format, but a little bit different now that its sister deck has kind of replaced it. The main difference between it is obviously you're playing cards like Inti, Croxa, Bone Crusher Giant, Graveyard Trespasser, but you still have a lot of the same core: Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Sheoldred, Smuggler's Copter. A lot of the sideboard cards are very similar, so I'm not going to cover this deck too much in depth. It's definitely a deck we've covered over and over again, and we've recently done a updated deck guide for this version of Rakdos Midrange on the channel. Go ahead and check that out. Probably a deck you could probably consider either the top or the second or third most powerful deck in the format. Izzet Phoenix, just depending on where the Rakdos Vamp deck ends up showing up once it's kind of settled in and people have a better idea of how to play around it. This is Izzet Phoenix. Nothing too fancy. One of the newer, more recent techs is putting Brazen Borrower into the deck. Other than that, for some reason when these decks are imported, it really hates bringing in the other copies of Sleight of Hand. But this is a 4 Sleight of Hand deck. You have a bunch of cantrips. You're trying to mill over cards with Picklock Prankster, get a Ledger Shredder in play, start conniving it, getting it really big. Eventually discarding your Arclight Phoenixes, casting 3 spells in a turn, getting them back, beating down your opponent. You also have Treasure Cruise, kind of refill that game plan, Galvanic Iteration, Temporal Trespass, kind of give you a combo finish to the deck. Beyond that, you're playing a bunch of red removal in the form of Fiery Impulse and Lightning Axe to deal with most of your opponent's creatures. Lightning Axe notably can deal with Vein Ripper if you have a creature in play to sack. Most notably, Arclight Phoenix would be the best one. But other than that, this deck hasn't really changed a whole lot. A lot of what changes is your sideboard. This version happened to be playing some Young Peasies and some Crackling Drakes. Also has Ashiok Dreamwonder to keep your opponents searching your deck. So, relevant against decks like Lotus Field Combo, being able to search out their lands with Sylvan Scrying. Also a slow mill thing. Can be reasonable in the mirror match, reasonable against control, though I suspect you probably most want it against Lotus Field Combo and against the mirror match. Anger of the Gods, mainly for Amalia Combo and other creature decks. Late Permission Suite against the control decks of the format that we'll certainly be covering here in a minute, but this is probably the best or second best deck in the format behind Rakdos Vampires currently. Another deck that you could argue is probably number 3 or number 4, that is Lotus Field Combo. Now this deck basically goes through changes in what its win cons are. This version that we pulled up has no copies of Chandra in the main deck, does have the Lair of the Hydra kill possible to it, but the feature deck card in this deck is Archdruid's Charm. This allows you to wish for random creatures, whether it be Dromoka. Some versions you can wish for a Tarka. This version seems to be more all in on trying to either beat down with Dromoka or killing with Lair of the Hydra, which is certainly a thing. Other things, other tech, Hedge Mage is a nice... the Surveil lands are starting to make an appearance. This deck's a little bit all over the place right now in terms of what it's doing. People are trying to figure out the maximization of Archdruid's Charm in the deck, how many copies will be running that. Consensus seems to be 2 to 4. Also, whether you're the Arboreal Grazer version or whether you're the Strict Proctor? Yeah, Strict Proctor version. That kind of goes how you build your mana base. We've also done a deck guide on that I think will be coming out this week. But with some of the updates to that, some of the updates to the sideboard, this version was choosing to run the Approach of the Second Sun as a win con, which means, they have the Fae of Wishes combo. So you basically, with this version, you get to Archdruid's Charm or Dark Petition for Fae of Wishes, cast granted, get Approach of the Second Sun to win the game. Most of the versions are tending to run Chandra on the main deck rather than one of the Wish cards, either this or Mastermind's Acquisition. It uses Chandra in conjunction with Balagate Recovery to just dome your opponent over and over again once you get the Omniscience in play. This is typically a turn 4 combo deck, which is pretty reasonable into a format full of Izzet Phoenix and Rakdos midrange. It does have some weaknesses, obviously, but is a solid deck, had a reasonable Pro Tour overall, and is either the number 3 or number 4 deck in the format currently. The other debatable deck that's number 3 or number 4 would be Amalia Combo. The TLDR on this one is you get Amalia into play, you get a Wild Growth Walker into play, and find some way to either gain life or explore. You have this pseudo-infinite combo that stops once Amalia hits 20, blowing up the board, leaving you with a 20 power creature and an absurd amount of life. Either you attempt to kill your creature with your 20 power creature, or you untap and cast Aetherflux Reservoir after you've explored a bunch, putting this card on top, doming your opponent. It's basically what the deck does. The rest of the deck is designed almost entirely to maximize that combo. Some versions run a backup version with different creatures, usually different creature beatdown plans. Sentinel of the Nameless City usually is involved in that beatdown game plan, but some of the versions from the Pro Tour moved away from it, opting for Fauna Shaman in the main deck instead, trying to maximize the amount of combo they had. But basically this is a combo deck with an okay beatdown plan, not as good with a beatdown plan as something like Winota was, but the main combo can be pretty tricky to deal with, and there was one that did make the top 8 of the Pro Tour. It is somewhat of a little bit of a tricky deck to play. You do have to get 3 pieces into play to combo off, and it is kind of a known quantity at this point, and its power has waned a little bit in recent weeks, but still very powerful deck, one of the top decks in the Pioneer format. Kind of an honorable mention to our 5/5A control deck of the format, and that is Dimir Control rather than Azorius. Azorius is certainly the better deck overall, at least in terms of putting up results and such. But this deck was piloted, I believe, solely by Gabriel Nassif at the Pro Tour to an 8-2 finish overall. The difference between the black decks and the white decks is you get access to the Edict effects, which is relevant in the new Vein Ripper world. But you also get to run, Thoughtseize to disrupt combo, which makes you a little bit better against Lotus Field than blue-white control would be. However, you do have a lot of the same tools, a lot of the same counterspells. You're trading slightly worse counterspells and slightly worse sweepers for a little bit better interaction against combo and things like Fatal Push and Shouldered's Edict being a little bit better against early creatures than some of White's options like Get Lost or March of the Otherworldly Light. The new addition to the deck, Deadly Cover-Up, potentially allows you to blow up the board and then potentially take, say, if your opponent's got an Amalia in the graveyard, just stripping that of their ability to win the game. You still get Torrential Gearhulk, Shark Typhoon to win the game, Dig Through Time, Memory Deluge is kind of card advantage, and then the sideboard you kind of get to further take advantage of Black's tools like Kalidas, Meathook Massacre against the creature-based decks. But basically you're trading which win cons do you want to play with and which interaction you think is better, the white counterspells and sweepers and win cons, or Black's a little bit better anti-combo-ish and better spot removal packages. And the aforementioned Azorius Control, this deck has always been kind of hovering in the top 5, top 10 in the format of recent note. Kind of got a big boost with the presence of Amalia, as this deck is kind of an absolute house against that deck. It is okay against Rakdos and Izzet Phoenix. It's probably a slight dog in both of those matchups, but is okay against them. Struggles a little bit against some builds of Lotus Field combo. So it's an overall fine deck that maybe doesn't have as solid footing as it did a couple of weeks ago whenever Amalia was a little bit bigger part of the format. But still, you have the best counterspells in the format, the best sweepers in the format, the best planeswalkers in the format, combined with things like Memory Deluge and Dig Through Time as card advantage along with Teferi. And overall, this is a solid deck you probably can't go wrong with if you do like control decks in other formats. And it's certainly a deck that still has legs in the Pioneer format and rounds up our top 5 decks for this month.